What I've created is what I'll call 7 archetypes. And this built on some work that was done a long time ago by my mentor, Ian McMillan, in an underrepresented book called Corporate Venturing, which if you haven't read it and you're in this area, it might be a good one to pick up. There's still a lot of lessons in it that are relevant, but it needs to be updated because since that was published in the early 90s, organizations have changed, the world has changed. We've got the digital revolution, which is making things possible. So I thought it was important to bring it into the current state. And we all know one of the fundamental challenges if you're trying to do innovation related work is that the weight of the core business is kind of like that elephant, and your little new businesses are just getting started. And very often the systems, the processes, the resource allocation, the rewards, I mean, there's an endless list of things that are put in place to serve the needs of the core business, but they actually turn out to be really harmful when you think about a new business. And so you're contemplating getting started, you want to do innovation, maybe you haven't done much of it yet. So you have some choices about how to go about launching new things. And the spectrum is very wide. And the good news is there's lots of choices. The bad news is there's no perfect choice. And your venture or your venturing programs are likely to move around in terms of where they belong in the organization as they mature, because different conditions are suitable for different kinds of businesses. So the first observation I would make is any venture goes through at least 3 stages. There's the ideation stage. Everybody thinks that's where the challenge is. It's not. The human beings are ingenious. We have more good ideas than we'll ever be able to implement. Plus, a lot of our good ideas are way before their time. I mean, we had the Jetsons and flying cars in 1962. And my friend Amy Webb tells me that the archetype for flying cars was around in the 1800s. So it's not that we can't think up things. It's that bringing them into reality is a lot more challenging. So you have ideation, then you have incubation, which is that period in the middle when you're going from an idea to something you can take to market. And then you have acceleration, which is the process by which something that you started now must be made mature and it gets to join the elephants, at their side of the table, at their side of the seesaw. So bear that in mind as we go through these, because different conditions will suit different ventures differently. So the first and least stressful from the point of view of the established organization is you just give an innovation challenge to a line manager. So it produces the least resistance, it has the least chaos that it creates. But as we all know, line managers are really busy people. They've got lots of other things to do. And so your main business is kind of like this train running. And if you put your new business, which requires dedication of time and attention, just in that structure, it's very likely to get lost. So it's not a bad way to get started, but it's hard to get something material to come out of that setup. A second archetype is you actually create a little structure for it, but it reports to some kind of line division. So it's its own little division. Maybe you have a couple of full-time people. That's better from the point of view of the venture getting the attention that it needs. But we all know, let the core business get into trouble, let it have a bad quarter, let something go on that requires management attention, and they just don't pay attention to it. I have a case like that going on right now where at the end of 2020, it was, Rita, you've got to come and talk to our team. You've got to be part of our management group. We've got to set this thing up. It's urgent. Talk to our board. So I have a board conversation in January. And then the quarter doesn't go so well. And, oh, gee, we're really busy with other things. And they just called me to say this program is probably going to be put on hold for at least 6 months, and we'll see. And that just is what happens if you have the weight of the line business overwhelming what goes on in the business. Now, a third place to put a venture might be in R&D or whatever counts for R&D in your organization. And that has the advantage that it has the time and the space to get its natural attention. It has the disadvantage that sometimes people in R&D get very infatuated with technology. They forget about the customer. And you're also separate from the core business, which is good, in the point of view of getting the attention that you need. It's bad because when you come back and say, hey, I've got this cool new thing for you to look at, the core business kind of looks at it and goes, not invented here, sorry very much. So pluses and minuses. Fourth is what IBM did when they launched their very successful Emerging Business Opportunity Program, is they created a senior staff leader whose sole job it was to look after what they call their emerging business opportunities. And over the course of about 5 years, they really built this into a very, very effective innovation machine. And the way it would work is they would take a senior person, they would give them some kind of mandate. So go figure out pervasive computing as an example. And that line person would be responsible for assembling a team, a small team, typically in the beginning, sorting out what the business model could look like. And then what they would do is they would fold innovation projects or innovation programs or core technology programs underneath that emerging business opportunity. So when Lou Gerstner was CEO of IBM, they launched 23 of these things. I believe 18 of them went on to become billion-dollar businesses. So that can be quite an effective structure because it has the effect of forcing an alignment between the existing business and the new business. But it does take a lot of management time and attention. And that is the downside. You have to have senior leaders who are just bloody minded about making sure these things get what they need. Then you could create an actual new ventures division. And there are companies that have been very successful with this. I was part of studying the Nokia NVO, as they called it, New Ventures Organization, during the very successful run in the early 2000s, when what they did with the NVO was they structured it very differently than the core business. So it didn't have P&L responsibility, and they would do what they called V-stage ventures. So a venture one stage was very simple. You could write a 2-page document. You could get something like 10,000 euro funding to do an experiment, to test a proof of concept. If it passed that stage, the venture board would then look at a proposal from you for V2. And V2 was the stage at which you now had a dedicated team. It was still located in the ventures organization, but you now had the time and the space to experiment, to play around, to challenge. And if the V2 venture progressed enough, this would be at the incubate stage, right? If they got to acceleration, then it would go to V3, and then you'd have a very serious conversation between whatever it was going to land in the core business, and it would then graduate from the new ventures division. So that's the 5th archetype. 6th archetype is you can actually have the venture report directly to the CEO. Sometimes that's the best way to do things. If you have an existential crisis, you need to innovate your way out of it really fast. But again, CEOs are busy people. And the downside of that structure is CEOs can fall in love with their ventures. And many of the most substantial flops, that we've seen in life in the venturing world, things like Iridium or Amazon's failed Fire phone or things like that. These are basically CEO pet projects, and it's risky, right? So you have to be sure that you're actually looking at the thing through the lens of, is this a viable entity versus is it something the CEO just has and interesting. And the 7th archetype, which I think is really new, it was not in the original formulation of this framework, and it's enabled by digital in a big way, is what many people call the agile organization. My colleague, Michael Sikorsky, who's a 3-time entrepreneur, really very, very at the cutting edge in terms of people strategies, he calls it the permissionless organization. And companies like Amazon or Netflix organize this way. So what they'll do is they'll take a big challenge, something like what the EBO program was designed to do, but instead of putting it with one person or one team, they'll have lots of small teams focused on a specific element of that challenge. So, let's say you're a typical company and you want to do something that involves a B2B offering across, a range of organizations. In a typical company, you'll have 1 or 2 people go check this out. But in these permissionless organizations, what they'll do is they'll send like 12, 30, 50 of these tiny small teams. Amazon calls them 2 pizza teams, to swarm around a particular element of that problem. And they'll solve that specific problem. They'll be dedicated, they'll be focused, they'll just be focused on, let's say it's a B2B thing. Okay, how do we get purchase orders done 48 hours rather than 4 days, right? And that team will just maniacally focus on that problem. And then they get integrated back with, and there's all kinds of words for these. There's scrum masters and that kind of thing. But it's really taking agile into the world of venturing. And at that point, your whole organization is really the home for venturing. It happens all over the place. Now, this is still relatively rare. I think most organizations are organized in a much more sort of hierarchical way. But however you do it, here's the goal, which is to get some kind of decent balance between your core business, the big, heavy thing that's driving everything, and your little new businesses, which are just starting to emerge. So for this group, resources that we pulled together for innovators, for your tribe. First one to talk about is I have a free net present value calculator. Those of you that know my book, Discovery Driven Growth, will know that we talked about it in that book. We showed you how to use it there. Then it kind of fell out of date, but I've had a lot of inquiries for it, so we've revived it. And if you go to valise.com and on the resources tab, it's available for free download. You can just go there, pick it up. And what it basically does is it says, you're an innovator. Somebody's asking you what haptic technology combined with 3D printing means for the future of spare parts. You have no idea. I have no idea. We don't know. And so sure enough, somebody in your organization is going to come along and ask you for either an NPV or a return on investment calculation or something else, which is completely impossible. So what the bare bones NPV is designed to do is it allows you to put in your assumptions about how long is it going to take you to get to launch? How long is it going to take you to get into the market? How long are you going to enjoy an advantage? When are competitors going to catch up? And then a couple of baseline assumptions. So without having to, torture yourself with a quarter by quarter spreadsheet, you can put in 9 variables, you get an NPV. And what's great about that is you're just sitting in front of these people who go, well, I don't think it's going to last that long. Fine, put in their numbers. The calculation just recalculates. So you can actually get a very rough estimate of the lifetime value of a project by doing that. So have at it. Feel free. If you have comments, I'd love to hear more. We've also got a lot of articles and videos available on the valise.com website. There's also a newsletter on LinkedIn. You can subscribe to that. I do a brief news update every Tuesday. That's on Substack. I also have a deeper dive monthly newsletter that you can subscribe to on my website, which is ritamcgrath.com. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm on YouTube. And every Friday, I do a fireside chat with people who I just happen to think are super interesting. And they're free and they are recorded. They're back up on YouTube if you want to see the past ones. And many of them will be people that this community really loves to hear from. So people like Alex Osterwalder, people like Glenn DeVries, who founded Medidata. We've got entrepreneurs there. We've got corporate innovators there. And I think it's a really interesting lineup that you'll enjoy. So 1 minute about Valise. A few years ago, I got really frustrated that, I research innovation, I talk about it, I do it. And then when it comes to actually doing it, people get back home, to their organization, and it's puzzling, right? It's like, how do I do this? How do I structure for it? How do I measure it? How do I, and what I really felt there was a need for were some tools. And after many fits and starts, we finally got some things going. We have an innovation mastery scale, which we're launching. We also have some software, which we use to do that middle part, that incubation part. So if you're interested in learning more about that, ask Hans, he can always find me, and so forth. So please do keep in touch. You can reach me on my Columbia website, email. I'm pretty available, and so that's some food for thought with luck. So I'll stop sharing, and we can get into your questions.
Thanks a lot, Rita. And I must say, I've been seeing, your newsletter and content, and I mean, you're always everywhere. So that's I don't know if you sleep at all, but that's what I see. I had 2 questions, kind of to frame the conversation. You talked about ventures, and so there is all kinds of definitions or opinions about what a venture is. So in your research, what is your definition of a venture?
Well, I define an innovation as something new that creates value. And if you think about the range of things you could be doing, all the way from, I know the market, I know the technology, but I need to take my tech stack to the cloud, right? That's very innovative. That's a new thing, but you know who you're doing it for, and you know pretty much what the technology demands are, all the way through to this haptic, 3D recognition thing I was illuminating before. I think I would call that's an innovation, and that may or may not be a venture. The way I define a venture is it's actually a discernible separate activity from business as usual.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is there, does it matter H1, H2, H3, or any other kind of criteria you attach to it?
Well, you're probably familiar. I have a portfolio model that I use, and the way I talk about things, and it's related to the Horizons for Growth. But I think what's changed since the Horizons for Growth model was published, and by the way, it's a terrific model. I don't have any qualms with it, but it puts timestamps on the horizons. And what I've found is that you can go from a Horizon 3 to something in your core business incredibly fast these days. I mean, you can do it in a matter of weeks. And so I prefer to think about it in terms of levels of uncertainty. So we talk about the core business. So I know who I'm doing it for. I know what it is. Then we've got new platforms. And the challenge with a new platform is this is something that's ready to go into acceleration, or it is in acceleration. And it's got to be a commitment. You know, the company can't just dabble. Like Amazon could not just dink around with Amazon Web Services. If I'm going to put my tech infrastructure in your hands, I need to know you're there. I need to know you funded it. I need to know it's committed. I need to be able to trust you. So a new platform kind of venture is that growth curve. Then we have your options. And the thing about options, which would be equivalent to the level Horizon 3, is you want lots and lots and lots of them because you're going to fail a lot. And you want small things that buy you the opportunity to get to something bigger in the future. But you also want the right to stop. So in discovery-driven growth, I talk about managing projects, ventures through checkpoints. And so at every checkpoint, what you want to do is what I call race. Do I need to redirect? Maybe I should accelerate. Maybe things are moving really fast. Maybe I should just continue, or maybe I should exit. And we force people to ask that question whenever they hit a key checkpoint. So that's one of the big sort of management differences between a business as usual kind of thing versus a new thing. With the new thing, you have to be prepared to stop. Otherwise, you don't have option value.
You mentioned ownership. I guess, when things go right, like things go developing well, everyone wants the ownership. But what does ownership mean? Is it paying the bills? Is it decision making? Is it risk and rewards? All of it?
Well, it's all of it. So the way I would connect that to what really goes on in companies is that there's three kinds of leaders, I would say, in an organization, and they own the ventures in different ways. So at the very top of the house, you have executive leadership, and their job is to say this, not that. Yes, it's okay to go into groceries. No, it's not okay to go into groceries. So what's the broad strategic thrust that allows you to set priorities and clearly pursue certain things? So if I were to give this a person, right, back in the day when A.G. Lafley came into Procter & Gamble as their CEO, the company was in trouble. And he had this revelation. He said, my God, there are brilliant ideas in the world that have not originated in our R&D labs in Cincinnati. And he launched a thing he called Connect and Develop, which was go outside. And he gave his senior leaders metrics around this, right? You have to show me that 50% of what you're working on originated somewhere outside the walls of P&G. So he set very clear, broad direction. Then we have the entrepreneur. So one of the discoveries that came into P&G through this process was the spin brush. And this is this little spinning toothbrush, which was launched by a guy named John Osher. By the time P&G bought it, it was already in market. It had done well. It was generating revenue. But Osher's this like classic serial entrepreneur. So, his first business, he started it when he was 8. And it consisted of charging his classmates to be able to go have a peek at oil paintings his parents had done in painting class that happened to be of naked ladies. And he charged his chums the lunch money for doing this. Now, okay, you take a guy like that, he's going to come into Procter & Gamble. Is he going to be happy coming to your Thursday update meeting? Is he going to fill out your personnel forms of this many people at this level relative to that many people? No, he thinks anybody that is a P&G lifer is just hopeless, right? So you got to have this role in the middle. And when I say ownership, this is an incredibly important role. And there are many people that play this role, but the role itself is what I call a Sherpa. So this is often somebody who's been around a long time, has a great deal of organizational social capital, has a lot of gravitas, is great at figuring out where to keep things separate and where to bring things together. So the reason I call them Sherpas is it's kind of like if you wanted to climb Mount Everest, right? You need your Sherpa who says, oh, no, we're not taking that route today because the weather conditions are like this. We're going to stop and go back. And so what I find is organizations don't give enough credence to that role in the middle, that Sherpa role, because very often when those people do their job right, and this is now back to ownership, they're giving ownership of the success away. They're working behind the scenes. They're invisibly sort of giving people credit for things, even if the people didn't actually do anything to deserve them, which, by the way, is one of the big problems with venturing because we lose the real story of what actually happened. And so with any venture, you have these myths that open up about who did what and achieved success. And one of the saddest things I have observed over and over and over again, you take a venture all the way through Accelerate. Right. So now it's big, it's getting big, it's growing out of control. And often the person in charge of it loses the plot, right? So the systems start to crash and customer demand is out of scope and whatnot. And so that person often gets sidelined and somebody new who's going to straighten out these operations gets brought in, and everybody forgets who actually started the thing, and it's the operator who then gets all the credit for it. And then we expect the operator to be able to know how to do the next big thing, and they don't have that skill set. So it's been fascinating to watch that over time in ventures.
I can see that. And Janine is asking, do you see Sherpas also being catalyst, or is catalyst a different role?
Do I see what being the catalyst?
So the Sherpas.
Oh, the Sherpas, they can be. They can be. They're very often the ones that'll sort of say, CEO, I think there's a really big opportunity in there. Do you want me to get a small team to go look at it? They can often be the people that are, because they're so connected. They've got this incredible social connection across the organization. So they often are the ones that ease and catalyze new thinking.
Okay, wonderful. Peter, I'll get to you shortly. One question still from my end on understanding the concept. So you mentioned these archetypes. Mm-hmm. Would you say it works best that you define or decide upon a archetype per venture, or you set company-wide, hey, we approach ventures this way? So per venture or company-wide?
That's one of those it depends situations. If you want to get to archetype 7, that has to be company-wide, because it's very hard to have a few people doing this new thing their way. I mean, I've seen it happen where you get one division to do it, but that's usually not going to have a big impact on the whole organization. So I think in that archetype, you need to have senior team alignment that I think really makes it go. Now, even in that archetype, you're still going to have parts of the company that operate like a traditional hierarchy. And you're still going to have HR to police the rules and finance to pay the bills. And I mebut there's still going to be people who aren't part of these little agile teams, right? Even at Amazon, they have, procurement. But I think otherwise, it really is one of those, right now for the next 6 months or so, where does this thing belong best? And what you'll sometimes see is these projects move across the organization in different formats. So I don't think there's a huge benefit in somebody saying, okay, all ventures are going to be in a new ventures division. Even at Nokia, when they did that, if the venture was related enough to, say, their core networks business, it would stay in networks. It wouldn't go to the NVO. So NVO was really just for new business models, new kinds of customer sets, new kinds of end users.
Interesting. Peter, your question is still relevant. I see you you raised your hand, but then I don't see it raised anymore. Feel free to come on mic.
Yes, thanks. I still do have a question, and I hope it's relevant. I'm wondering what is the extent to which these approaches are applicable for innovating the core itself?
Oh, I think you have to do both. What we always forget is the core doesn't stay static. Today's core business is going to be quite different than what yesterday's core business was. So Scott Anthony and the folks at Innov8ers have a really great way of thinking about it. They call it dual transformation. And what they talk about is transforming the core, building the new, but what makes it suitable for corporate venturing as opposed to startups is you've got this capability connector. So to take a historical example of this, when Fujifilm decided that digital was going to radically change their core business, they could have done a lot of different things, but what they decided to do was go into using their skills in imaging in new areas. So they anchored their company basically on a set of core capabilities and then sought where else in the world are those core capabilities relevant. But what made them have an advantage over a startup is that they had that deep scientific and infrastructure knowledge.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
Rita, I want to focus on this, the setup where you say, hey, we're having a separate division for venture. So now, and many kind of talk companies is about venture building, right? Which is often indeed a separate unit supposed to give birth to new ventures. BP Launchpad is one of them. There's many companies embracing that approach. If we can zoom into that, any examples that come to mind, any kind of pitfalls maybe of this approach as well?
Sure. Well, the pitfalls are, we need a new venture, but we don't, we sort of saw it off from the mothership and it goes off on an ice flow and it doesn't connect back. What I think made the approach so successful at IBM, and I'll give you some other examples, was that the budget was protected. So the guy that was in charge of it, and I'm forgetting his name now, Ralph something, but the guy that was the reporter, he reported directly to Palmisano, he reported directly to Gerstner, and they watched that budget like a hawk. So you as a line manager could not touch the budget that was allocated to venturing. So they protected the budget, but they, remember, these are very senior people that they pulled out of the core business and put in charge of these things. So those people also had connectors back. If you think about them, they're sort of a super Sherpa, right? They have connectors back to the core business. And what they did at IBM to make it stick was they took existing units and folded them into the EBOs. So what happened was the EBOs didn't get force fit into some structure that didn't fit them. They were able to form their own structure. So if you think about it, a services business is going to have a different structure than a product business, for example. And so they were allowed to build that. So I think the big pitfalls are you have this isolation from the rest of the company. When the rest of the company goes through some kind of financial trauma or setback, or, forever, we're going to return to the core, shareholders are screaming, whatever, you're the first thing that's going to be on the chopping block. A really clever way that this worked incredibly well is at Klockner. You probably know Klockner. They're a metal services company based, the headquarters is in Duisburg, but their CEO saw digital and digital platforms coming and said, if we don't go digital, we're toast. And the way he went about it was very interesting because he didn't make, big, bold pronouncements. What he said was, our supply chain is a mess. We have customers sending us faxes to order. And so they tried to innovate in Duisburg. That didn't work. So he took 2 engineers and he sent them off to Berlin, which is the Silicon Valley of Germany, right? And he said, look, I do whatever you think makes sense. Learn from the ecosystem. Do something digital that makes us easier to do business with for our customers. That was basically his mandate. Do something, anything that's digital, right? So start small. So what they started with was the fax system. Now, here's what's interesting to me. So they digitized what had been faxes and they made people able to do it electronically. But in the fax system, the fax would hit the boundary of the firm, and then there would be stuff that happened after the fax arrived. Well, with the digital system, the digital order hit the boundary of the firm. What happened afterwards was exactly the same. So they're introducing digital without creating the antibodies that often emerge in the core business. So the next thing they did was they said, well, if we've got digital orders coming in, maybe it would make sense to give a digital tag to all the things being ordered. So the next thing was a digital ordering system. So now digital order hits the boundary of the system. And now it's easier for the guys on the other side. They now know what aisle they have to go to pick the pipe off the thing, right? Easier, better. We welcome it. So they introduced it in a really clever way in terms of not sort of instantly creating antibodies in the other or in the sort of existing organization. The other thing that I think Gisbert Ruhl, who's the CEO, recognized, and I thought this was amazing, was he said, yes, the Berlin people are going to do what the Berlin people do. They're going to do what startups can do. They're going to find new applications. But what's going to differentiate us is the deep expertise, the knowledge, the experience that we have in Duisburg. And so he gave equal credit to both sides of that equation. And I think that's something often a lot of CEOs overlook. Like you'll see some of them. I love it when these middle-aged CEOs decide they're going to put on t-shirts and white sneakers and they're going to be the cool kids, right? and they kind of give the impression that it's the cool kids are all that matters and like the old core boring business is, just dead. And that's just such a mistake.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Alex, feel free to come on mic and ask your question if you can.
Yeah, thanks. I was already coincidentally talking about Gisbert.
Oh, you got.
Yeah. My question was, when you listened to Gisbert, you could tell that he was really open to change. He said, look, I started reading different stuff. I started understanding that how was I wrong in the past? I went to see the young guys in the startup world. I went to the Silicon Valley, what have you. So ultimately, change is always driven by people. Mm-hmm. And if the people at the top are not, questioning themselves, reflecting, what have you, then it's far harder or it doesn't happen at all. So you talk to many of those gentlemen, and mostly gentlemen, unfortunately, more women to come, thank God. How do you intervene? How do you support them that they're really opening up, becoming vulnerable, and that they say, look, I really have to rethink my whole setup. And it starts with the I, not the we.
Yeah, it does.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there are ways, right? I think the first condition is they have to be willing to start that journey. If they're not even willing to do that, if they're basically rejecting the whole premise, you're going to be banging your head against a wall, I think. But let's say they're open-minded, but they just don't know where to start. I think some really good provocations are to have them exposed to the way other companies do things. So what I'll often do is I'll take two of my clients and take someone who's a little bit farther along in their journey, and they'll spend a day shadowing, each other and sort of, how do you do things here? Why do you do it that way? So that's a way of beginning to open their minds. I think a second practice is some kind of coaching. Now, that could be a formal executive coach. That could be coaching from someone who's perhaps more experienced, maybe someone who's retired, who's been through this before, who could be available to you on call. And I have a number of those in my network. So people who, I've got this intractable personnel issue, let's say. So I'll give you an example of one that just happened last week. It was a financial services institution, and a lot of the senior employees didn't want to come into the facility. And the trouble is, the law requires somebody senior to be in the facility. And so the CEO is like, what do I do? And so one of our coaches helped talk them through how they could resolve that problem, in a good way. So that coaching is another example. I think a third way is to assign them a reverse mentor, which is, as Gisbert did, put them together with a 22-year-old and have them, say, well, how would you approach this problem? How would you approach it? So I think they've got to be personally exposed to multiple situations. There's a terrific book on this exact kind of theme, which is called The CEO Test. It's by a guy named Adam Bryant, who for years wrote the corner office column for the New York Times. And now he's with a company that mentors CEOs. And I did a fireside chat with him some weeks back. So if you look on my YouTube channel and just search Rita McGrath, Adam Bryant, you'll find it. And we cover a lot of those topics because he points out that for today's CEOs, if you're going to be in a CEO role today, transformation is not an option. And if you go about transformation with a 1970s mindset, it's not going to work.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Rita. Janine, over to you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So earlier you mentioned that we have lots of ideas, and some of them.
Is she on mute?
Not hearing mine. It's probably your headset. I'm not hearing you.
Is that fixed?
No, it is. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, problem with my headset. Yeah, so early, thank you. Great talk. I'll always love hearing the things you have to share. So earlier you mentioned that most organizations have lots of ideas. Some of them can be maybe too early, and I'm guessing sometimes we're a little late. Maybe we have a novel approach to something that's already out there. So I'm kind of curious how you, whether through the archetypes or through your race gates, how you address issues of timing, or maybe it's not timing as much as pace, and especially if you have a mixed bag. So in my case, I'm dealing with two ideas right now. One's very small, needs to move really fast. It's not particularly novel, but it's well timed and it could do well. And I have another idea that we've been cooking it for 3 years and it's finally starting to get traction. And I'm going to say we've been very inconsistent with our approaches and teaming models and things like that. So I'm just kind of curious how you handle timing and pace.
Well, I do it through this discovery-driven planning checkpoint approach. So sometimes you can move through checkpoints super fast, as you're finding with your more developed idea, and sometimes it's just hard work. You have to really slog it through. So what I do with respect to, is it ready? Is the world ready for this? In the book Discovery Driven Growth, we talk about some things you can look at. So the bare bones NPV, if you do such a thing, is one signal, right? If it's shrinking, that's probably not a venture you want to continue to pursue. I also think it's valuable to start with the end in mind and work backward. So if you said, okay, if this thing was a fantastic success by 2021, 2023, what would it look like? Like, what would each quarter resemble up to that point? And that can give you some reality around, okay, here's the urgency and the pace that we need to move for if that's our goal. So I think some way of starting with the end in mind and working backward is super helpful.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Tim, over to you then.
Yes, hi, thanks Rita. My question was, In your experience and in all the cases that you've looked at, have you found that there's one archetype that tends to be easier for organizations that they just get stuck on the elephant side of the seesaw? You know, there are those organizations that they may like the idea of this novel idea or innovation, and they use the word innovation. Mm-hmm. But when it actually comes to putting, hitting the rubber on the ground, it just doesn't get that traction. Have you found that there's one particular archetype that's just easier to unstick that type of organization?
Yeah, for that kind of organization, I would go with archetype 4. Unless it's a crisis, in which case you're going to be forced to do archetype 5, but 4 is helpful because what it does is it gives power to innovation. And this is something Alex Osterwalder and I talk about a lot, which is what goes wrong with innovation is usually human. It's power dynamics, it's jealousy, it's this thing's unpredictable, it's going to cost me my bonus, it's, the shareholders are glowing about this thing and my nice, steady, predictable business is getting no love. It's that kind of thing. So what archetype 4 does, if a powerful person is prepared to accept this role, now that's a much harder question to solve for, but let's say you got someone with a lot of power, a lot of social gravitas, who's willing to do this, put themselves on the line to make this work, that will often break through a lot of the resistance, because now what you got is someone with real chops. And they have to have resources, by the way. You can't put them in the role and then say, oh, go beg, borrow, and steal for the people that you need and the report that you need. They have to actually be first in line for resources. So the two have to go together.
Great, thanks.
Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, Hans. Thank you, Rita. It actually follows on from that question, actually. So you talked about, when you were giving the IBM model, the fact that that very senior person was credible within the organization, had the relationships so they could sort of perform the Sherpa role. Does that mean that you would always appoint someone who has been in the organization for a while, so they're senior and known, or would you sometimes bring in someone externally who might be fantastic but doesn't have those relationships internally and doesn't understand the internal?
Yeah, I have seen it work. So let me give an example where I've seen it work. So Walmart tried for 2 decades to get digital into their DNA, and it just didn't happen. The weight of that brick and mortar store, people that had grown up for 30 years in their career, they knew how cross-docking worked, they know everything. And digital was just, like an ant, they threw it away. And their CEO, Doug McMillon, finally came to the conclusion there was no way an insider was ever going to be able to break through that. And so what he did was he made a huge and very controversial acquisition. He acquired a thing called Jet.com, which was run by a guy named Mark Laurie. And Mark Laurie was a serial entrepreneur. He'd founded Diapers.com, which got acquired by Amazon. They actually outcompeted Amazon as a startup, which is pretty hard to do. Then he had to work for Amazon for a couple of years, which he hated. He and Bezos just hated each other. It's like 2 alpha goldfish in a bowl. And the minute he could leave, he left. And then he founded something called Jet.com, which was a new way of distributing things. So Walmart very famously bought them for something like $500 million. And it was a big acquisition. And then what McMillan basically did was he said to everybody in the company, anything digital is going to go under Mark. So they bought Bonobos, they bought a bunch of these like direct-to-consumer brands, they bought a bunch of other small acquisitions, all went under Laurie, and Laurie's sole job was to inject this digital DNA into the company. But he had McMillan's unfailing, unflinching support and the support of the board, because it wasn't smooth sailing. I mean, they ended up shutting down a lot of those brands. They finally declared mission accomplished, gave up the Jet brand, which I think has been completely misunderstood in the world, right? Everybody's like, oh, it was a failure. No, if you go into a Walmart today, it is a completely different beast than it was when they bought Jet. So I think it can work. I'd say for the kind of venture where what you're trying to do is so different than whatever it was you were doing, you really need a new skill set. It can work. But to work, it has to have the unfailing support of the CEO. The person brought in must know what they're doing. I mean, they must really have a very strong track record. And with Spinbrush, same thing, right? They brought in an outsider, John Osher, who did that. And you really need to have the corporate-wide commitment to, yes, we are going to do this. Otherwise, it's just going to get so mixed up in politics. It's really, really hard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Khalil, over to you.
Thank you so much. for giving me the opportunity. Thanks, Professor, for the book. And,
Fabulous.
and for the dedication during one of Columbia's classes.
Fantastic.
My question, thank you. My question relates to the last chapter, which is about what transient advantage means to you personally. Have you reflected on these recommendations after the pandemic? Have you received feedback on how useful these are? Because I have personally benefited from them.
Yeah.
Further reflections.
So I think the world is caught up. So when I wrote that book, so End of Competitive Advantage came out in 2013. So near what is it now? 8 years ago now. And a lot of people were saying, I'm kind of getting to understand discovery-driven growth. I kind of get that, right? The lean startup movement did a great job of popularizing a lot of those ideas. But End of Advantage, I'm not sure I follow, right? This whole idea of tour of duty careers and access to assets, not ownership of assets and all that kind of thing was very foreign to people. So I was incredibly gratified. Just this week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I want to say the Wall Street Journal, which talked about workers now, as we're moving post-pandemic, workers now saying, guess what? Staying in the same place and being stable is not job security. Movement and building new skills is what's going to give me job security. And a lot of employers who aren't thinking that way are going to be in for a very rude awakening, because talented people with the capacity to grow are going to be moving. And Reid Hoffman and Chris Ye call this the tour of duty career environment, where you'll pick up on an opportunity or a project. You and the organization will work together for a while. And yet when it comes to an end, maybe you part, and it could be very amicable. And maybe you come back 3 years later when that same problem or opportunity presents itself. The other interesting thing is this kind of community, our kind of networks, are giving us the kind of social stability that we used to find at work. And I think this is something we also haven't really recognized, which is my relationship, say, with Hans, is going to endure no matter where he's working, no matter where I'm working, whether I go off and do something in Siberia for 2 years and I come back, and I could pick up the phone or get on a Zoom and call him and say, hey, I've got this idea, do you know anybody that might be interested in? We'll have this whole infrastructure built that never used to be possible before. And I think it's enabled by digital, of course, but I think employers don't realize that their borders are so porous, and that the thing that gives us stability and predictability is often our own personal networks.
Thank you, Rita. Paul, over to you then. Oh, Paul is no longer in the call, it seems. Alex, you had another question. Feel free to go on.
Just to complement, in an ecosystem world, these reviews where you look at the parallel opportunities portfolio, do you have experience with mixed teams, so to say, or mixed stakeholders reviewing those portfolios, or is it literally only within constituencies?
Oh no, I think it's mixed. Mixed teams are the best, absolutely. And you raise a really important point, Alex, which is that increasingly no firm produces some of the value that customers are buying. And so we're really seeing a shift in value from products and services to ecosystems, to transactions. Eric Joachim Staller has a great book on this. If you haven't looked at it, it's called The Interaction Field. And I think he's really onto something, because he's talking about, in a lot of today's economy, the product, you give that away. What you're benefiting from is the swarm of information around the product. And so it's a really different way of thinking about strategy, of thinking about, what value really is and to whom. And we have to be thinking much more broadly about ecosystems.
Thank you, Alex. Rita, my final question to you. I actually, since you started this session, I kept on thinking, why do you call these archetypes and not, for example, principles or pillars? I mean, is there a reason why you picked the word archetypes for these 7 constructs?
Yeah, because an archetype is like a template, right? It's a form of design. And what I really was trying to get across is no one of these is unambiguously better than another. Mm-hmm. We have some early evidence that you move faster and that you can do more in archetype 7, but that requires an enormous retooling of culture and rewards and mindset and everything. But the rest of them, they're pluses and minuses. And I think being So let's just say you're in that situation that was raised earlier where I haven't innovated in 30 years. I want to get a small team to start something. You may be better off doing a tiny proof of concept in an existing business, just having them try one little thing to say, hey, we can do this. So that may be where you start if you really have an organization that's actively opposed, right? If you have a big company, you know that you need to move fast, then Archetype 4 or this DNA injection like they did at Walmart that I was talking about earlier might suit. So I think it's very situational. And the reason I like Archetype is it conveys this notion of a template rather than a prescription.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We once, of course, also had your colleague Bill Fisher talking about hire. Is that a kind of upcoming archetype, or is it part of your number 7?
Hire would be 7. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. They're that idea of breaking your organization into lots of these small agile teams is very much like that. So Gary Hamel's great book Humanocracy has a lot of examples of companies that operate this way. And here's the challenge, right? So if you look at human beings, we have people without an organization who are Instagram stars, who make a living making funny YouTube videos, who've created brands on TikTok. In other words, the amount of human ingenuity that's out there, and because the cost of connecting has gotten so low, they can actually create all these creative things. And then we put them inside an organization. We go, okay, your job is to move this, pen from here to here all day long. And so we for benefits of efficiency, we squeeze all that ingenuity out of people. And so I think that's a real tragedy. I'll plug another book. So Martin Reeves and his colleagues at BCG have just published a fantastic book. It's called The Imagination Machine. And what they point out is that imagination is uniquely human. And what I particularly like about the book, and anybody who's in this community really should get a copy, is he goes from what sparks your imagination. And it made me think, because what sparks your imagination is something doesn't fit, something doesn't conform, you're surprised by something. And then he takes it all the way through. What do you have to do to keep an imagination on an ongoing basis? And one of the observations he made that I thought was really sharp was the pandemic is causing everybody to go, whoa, that doesn't fit my preconceived imagination, preconceived experience. So what we can expect, I think, as we come out of this, or as we move to whatever comes next, is a flourishing of imagination. We're just going to see new things everywhere, because all of us are having this moment of going, whoa, this doesn't fit my expectations or what I did before or anything like that.
Right. Yeah, well, we had indeed Martin last week, I believe. So if you are...
Did you? Oh, fantastic. Great book.
Recording, absolutely.
Yeah, great book.
I think, Aidan, your question kind of is a nice wrap-up for building on that story. Aidan, if you want to come on mic and ask your question.
Thanks, Hans. Rita, how you doing? Greetings.
Hey, I'm good. How are you? Love the background, Aidan.
Very well. Never miss an opportunity to listen to the great Rita McGrath. I had a question, Rita, based on just what you said there. I said in my chat there, Warren Buffett famously said, only when the tide goes out do you discover who's swimming naked. But now the tide's coming back in again, and it's a very different shoreline. So for the organizations who expect things to go back to normal, I often think of the great story of Kodak and Fujifilm, how they reacted. But have you got any modern exemplars that you can cite for us to learn from?
In terms of adapting?
Yeah, great adaptation stories to a new ecosystem or a new shoreline.
I think on the B2B side, Honeywell is amazing. They've really gone from being a company that makes things to a company that really makes a lot of their money from software. Ørsted, the Danish former oil and gas company, now is a renewable company. I think they're amazing. In healthcare, I think what Aetna did and is continuing to do is really interesting. So there are some fantastic exemplars. There are also some companies that are going to really struggle, and I'm thinking here of an entire class of companies that benefited from the pandemic. So people that make lumber and people that make paint and people that make, cleaning supplies and people that do, their business has gone like this. And now they've got to adjust to the fact that all that demand is, if I wanted to build an extra room, I've probably built it already. And so that's going to be an adjustment for them.
Thank you, Rita. Anything else you want to add to the conversation we had?
Oh, just please do keep in touch. This is my tribe. I love you guys, and happy to have more conversations. If you want to find out more about Valise, be part of our community, help us build some tools, tell us what tools we should build. Please, I'd love to hear from you. We're just at that acceleration stage, and we know how hard that can be. So I need all the help I can get. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks a lot for sharing your wisdom with us, and also thanks to everyone on the call for chiming in. And of course, I hope to see you in one of the next sessions. Bye for now.
Thanks, Hans. Thanks for setting this up. So long, everybody.
Bye-bye.